Vegeta calls himself a super elite, but what does that mean? How is Saiyan society actually structured, and where did everyone rank? Essentially, what was the Saiyan hierarchy? One of the major themes of the Saiyan arc is how fundamentally different the ideals of Vegeta, a so-called super elite prince, are in contrast to Goku, a low-class warrior who was sent away because he was born into a lower class. So what makes them so different? Well, put yourself in the shoes of a Saiyan. When you're first born, you're immediately scanned for your power level. This one number will determine nearly the entirety of your life going forward. No pressure, right? You only have a few paths here. Either your power level is high enough to be chosen as a warrior from the very start, or it's not. You're then left in an incubator to develop over time, where your power level could potentially grow a little bit more. In Goku's case, he was developing very slowly, so much so that he spent 3 whole years in the incubator, couldn't even speak, and remained with a pretty low power level. This will also determine what class you're labeled as. Those with really low power will become engineers, butchers, some could even become scientists or butlers to the king. These are part of the non-combatant class. But the majority of those low-powered Saiyans will instead become infiltration babies. This is exactly what Goku was going to be chosen as while developing in the pod. A Saiyan baby who was so weak that society saw him as disposable. Goku, or rather Kakarot, was supposed to go to Earth, wipe out its population, and return home. Or die trying. It didn't really matter to the Saiyans either way. These infiltration babies have a really low survival rate, and while yes, Goku's planet was chosen by his father, Bardock, to save him from Frieza, he was still going to be sent away somewhere to conquer anyways, though his power was likely just high enough to be expected to survive, since when Raditz arrives on Earth, he acts pretty surprised when he realizes that his brother hadn't killed all the humans, even with a lower than usual power level. I should also note that Saiyans don't train. Most of them, even the low-powered ones, are naturally born with battle instincts, but there were special cases where some would get special training. On the other hand are those Saiyans whose power level was high enough from the start or after a bit of development in the incubator to be seen as upper-class fighters. Of course, the most obvious example of this is Vegeta, but instead I want to talk about someone a little weird. I want to use Raditz as an example of a Saiyan who was not shot off into space as a baby to die. Raditz gets a ton of flack in the Dragon Ball fandom for being, well, Raditz.
I was killed by Piccolo.
But he's actually a lot more impressive than people give him credit for. According to Akira Toriyama, Raditz was determined at birth to be an upper-level fighter, meaning his power level was high enough to skip the whole prove yourself as an infiltration baby step. He was placed in Nappa's squad, a group Vegeta would later join. So think about this for a second. Vegeta, the Saiyan prince, ended up on a team that Raditz was already a part of. Maybe Raditz wasn't such a joke after all. Now here's where things get a little complicated. Toriyama once said, Vegeta is the prince, and so he has a higher position due to his strength. But Raditz and Nappa have equal status. Let that sink in. Raditz and Nappa were considered equals. But wait, didn't Nappa call himself an elite in the original manga? Well, more recently, Toriyama has clarified that there were only 2 true elites, King Vegeta and Prince Vegeta, with around 10 middle-class Saiyans, including Nappa, right under them. So if Nappa and Raditz have equal status, this could potentially mean that Raditz is a middle-class Saiyan on the lower end. So in my mind, Raditz was born to a low-class family, but determined to be strong enough at birth to be made into a warrior right away, and could have possibly performed well enough to be considered a middle-class Saiyan. With that being said, this is debated. Other things like the Daizenshu and even Dokkan Battle call Raditz a low-class Saiyan. I've also seen people say that the wording of the quote could just mean that since Vegeta is the prince, he's above the 2 of them and they're really nothing compared to him, rather than a literal ranking. Saiyan society wasn't entirely rigid. Toriyama explained that Saiyans could move up the food chain if their battle power grew. In Raditz's case, his power level as an adult really wasn't that particularly impressive, with some sources saying 1200, 1500, or even 1600. So I'm not sure if I entirely buy that he's a middle-class Saiyan, but if he'd push himself harder, if their race wasn't destroyed, maybe he could have climbed to the middle class officially. Maybe the powers that be really did see potential in him. But here's where the divisions of the hierarchy become even clearer, because no matter how impressive Raditz was, in Vegeta and Nappa's eyes, he was always a low-class Saiyan.
I'll start things off. You shouldn't get too ahead of yourself, Raditz. So pathetic.
In essence, while there was a class hierarchy depending on power, it seems like what class your family belonged to also really mattered when it came to your societal treatment. Like in Tree of Might, where no matter how insanely strong both Kakarot and Turles are, Turles is still calling them both low-class Saiyans. So I'll just let you decide in the comments. Is Raditz a low-class Saiyan or a middle-class Saiyan born to a low-class family? All this is to say, Saiyans were only equal at the very second they were born, and then were quickly judged, labeled, and treated differently as soon as that scouter read their power level. Now that we've explored how systems work, let's look at the overall structure. At the very bottom, or really outside of the actual pyramid, are the non-combatants: engineers, scientists, butchers, and beats from Dragon Ball Super Broly. These could be really far removed from our normal perceptions of Saiyans, to the point where Beats says he's never actually been an Ozaru in his entire life. Some of these Saiyans were trained with weapons, like Beats with a ray gun. Then there's the actual fighters, with the bottom of the barrel being the low-class Saiyans. These would be Kakarot, Bardock, Leek, anyone who's labeled as a low-class Saiyan and Dokkan really. Most Saiyans belong here, with a few thousand. The Daisenshu claims that the average power level of the Saiyans here is 1,500, and that a lot of them tend to look alike, which, has certain implications. Above them are the mid-class Saiyans. This class is interesting because in the original manga, there was no such thing as middle class, only low class, elite, and super elite. Nappa calls himself an elite after all, but through interviews, Toriyama has expanded upon and seemingly replaced the term elite with middle class, and super elite with the simple elite. There are very few Saiyans in this tier, with only around 10 or so according to Toriyama. Nappa and Paragus are two of them, and like I said, Raditz could fit in here depending on how you interpret Toriyama's statement. There are also 10 Saiyans surrounding King Vegeta in the throne room scene of Broly, so I bet these were the 10 middle-class Saiyans mentioned by Toriyama. Finally, at the very top of the pyramid are the elite, or super elite as they used to be called. This is the most exclusive of the ranks, with only two members, the Prince and King Vegeta. This is really the main reason why elite and super elite from the manga don't work with how Toriyama further elaborates, since Nappa shouldn't call himself an elite if there's only the Prince and the King. So maybe that's why Vegeta killed him. Stolen valor, Nappa. So what was the power level range for each class? There's nothing really ever been said, so this is pure speculation. For non-combatants, 0 to 400. I say this because at the start of Z, Goku has a power level of 416, which is lower than what Raditz expected, but still thought he was useful enough. Above that, Leek in Broly notes that Kid Broly's power level is 920, which was already higher than his. For low-class Saiyans, I say 401 to 2000. Like I said, the Daisenshu mentions the average power level of Saiyans is 1500, and most Saiyans are in this category. This would mean that the snipers aiming at Frieza at the start of Broly were at the very top of the low class or at the very bottom of the middle class. But this range would put Raditz in the low class as well. For middle class Saiyans, I have 2000 to 5000. Nappa, after all, was one of the top Saiyans in his class, reaching 4000 when he fought Goku, though I extended it to 5000 because Paragus, who is well past his prime, had a power level of 4200 in Broly. This range could be even higher potentially, since even after reading Goku's power level of 8000 plus, Vegeta still thinks that they're gonna have a long match. Then there's the elite, which I have at above 10,000. This one's tricky because there does seem to be a huge gap between the elite and the middle class, but Vegeta at the start of Z was 18,000, later saying that he far surpassed the king when he was a kid. We don't have any real indication to how strong the king was, but I know someone out there is gonna point out that the dub of the Z Bardock special mentions Bardock getting close to a power level of 10,000 and quickly catching up to the king. But again, this is just in the dub. With that being said, though this power hierarchy is strict, that doesn't mean Saiyans couldn't potentially grow strong enough to get to a higher ranking. I mean, low-class Saiyans getting stronger and stronger due to their life-threatening missions was part of the reason Frieza decided to kill them all. As Toriyama explained, Bardock is in the upper ranks as far as low-class Saiyans go, but he isn't able to become a mid-class warrior. This rank is determined by an innate latent battle power, but naturally, if their battle power rises greatly afterwards, they can be promoted. A Bardock who had been stated to have a power level of over 10,000. so it seems like he was never promoted higher up because of societal pressures on planet Vegeta. Or Toriyama just never considered Bardock's power to be all that in his head. But we do know now that there was the possibility for vertical movement. This is true the other way around as well. For example, Gine was a low-class warrior. She was part of Bardock's squad, but she wasn't the best, and Bardock ended up having to save her over and over again. In the end, she stepped back from being a warrior and became a non-combatant. Similarly, Tarbell, Vegeta's brother, should have been born into royalty as an elite, but his power level was a total embarrassment to the king. He likely spent some time on planet Vegeta as normal, probably getting that special training I mentioned earlier, since Vegeta acts as if he knows him to some degree and didn't just see him as a baby. But since Tarbell never got much stronger, the king decided to banish him to a remote world. That's really how cutthroat and sad the system was. Even the king couldn't stomach a low-class son. On the other hand, King Vegeta was so scared that a Saiyan born to a mid-class father could potentially be stronger than his son that he sent Broly away to die. So maybe Broly could have been classified as an elite if King Vegeta wasn't an asshole. The whole subject of infiltration babies and banishments is kinda crazy considering the Saiyan race was actually really small in numbers by the time Frieza killed them. There were only a few thousand of them, and their life expectancy wasn't great because of how much combat they were in. You think if they spent more time training each other to become mid or elites, then maybe they could have actually stood something of a chance. This brings us back to the first arc of Dragon Ball Z. At its core, the Saiyan saga is a story about breaking free from destiny. It contrasts Goku's path of self-determination with Vegeta's pride in his status as a super elite. Saiyan society's rich hierarchy shaped these two warriors in vastly different ways. One saw strength as something earned through effort, while the other believed it was tied to birthright. Yet, as the saga unfolds, it's Goku who proves that greatness isn't dictated by a class or power level, but by the determination to rise above your limitations. The Saiyan saga challenges the idea that we are bound by the roles we're born into, showing instead that true strength comes from the choices we make and the effort we put into forging our own paths, something Vegeta learns and eventually evolves into. I also have a video explaining how the Bardock special ties into this idea if you want to check it out. I hope you learned something new. Be sure to Gallic gun that subscribe button, and if you're looking for more deep dives into the world of Dragon Ball, then check out my video explaining how each Saiyan survived the destruction of planet Vegeta.